The Harrow estate had always felt wrong to her, even in childhood, when she was too young to understand why the air in the halls seemed to hold its breath. The house never simply settled like other old homes, it listened. It watched. And on some nights, when the wind pushed against the shutters, it seemed to whisper her name, not lovingly, not playfully, but as if reminding her of something she was destined for. Something she was never meant to escape. She grew up hearing fragments of conversations abruptly silenced when she walked into the room, the quick exchange of glances between older relatives, the way her father's eyes lingered on her with a kind of pride that made her feel cold. The Harrows called themselves a family blessed by tradition, but the villagers nearby avoided their property the way people avoid deep water they can't see the bottom of. No one ever said exactly what they feared, but doors shut a little faster when she passed by, and elderly neighbors crossed themselves behind her back. When she turned 17, the house changed. The creaking floors seemed to shift beneath her as though adjusting to her footsteps. Locked doors she had never noticed before appeared slightly ajar. At night, she heard soft tapping behind her bedroom wall, like knuckles brushing from the other side. Her father became more attentive, more present, as though each day brought him closer to some long-awaited moment. He began gifting her heirlooms, rings, necklaces, lace gloves that had once belonged to Harrow women she never met. She wore none of them. They all felt cold, like they had been taken from bodies, not jewelry boxes. The first true warning came in the form of a late-night phone call. A woman's trembling voice whispered her name, begging her not to let history repeat. The call ended before she could ask who it was, but it left her with a chill so deep it felt carved into her bones. That night she dreamed of a woman in a torn wedding gown running barefoot through the forest, glancing over her shoulder as something lumbered after her. When she woke, her window was open, and muddy footprints trailed across the floor. Her father dismissed it as stress, as imagination, as the anxieties of a girl nearing adulthood. But his calmness unsettled her more than the dream. Because when she described the woman in white, he didn't look surprised. He looked irritated. As if someone had broken a rule. And then, one evening, she wandered deeper into the estate wing she was always told to avoid. Dust lay thick on everything except the brass doorknob of a room she had never entered. When she pushed inside, the smell of old roses and something metallic washed over her. Portraits lined the walls, dozens of Harrow daughters in wedding gowns, youthful and pale, each standing beside their fathers. Her stomach twisted as she realized every daughter's face had been scratched out. Every father's remained intact. She stared at the defaced portraits and felt the house exhale behind her, the cold breath of something patient. Something hungry. Something that had been waiting 18 years for her. The moment she uncovered the Harrow lineage rule, it didn't come from a dramatic confession or some ancient scroll tucked behind a wall. It arrived quietly, almost casually, the way unbearable truths often do. She had been rummaging through her grandmother's old belongings in the attic, looking for nothing in particular, when she found a small lacquered box sealed with a delicate silver clasp. By the third night, she was no longer pretending it was a coincidence. She waited awake, her phone on the nightstand, feeling the unease coil tightly in her stomach. When the phone rang, she answered instantly. The woman finally spoke more than a few words, her voice cracking with desperation. She warned her not to follow their tradition, begged her to leave the house, insisted that the fate awaiting her was worse than she could imagine. There was a sorrow in her tone, a trembling grief that made her skin prickle. She sounded like someone who had suffered the very thing she was warning against. Before she could ask what tradition the woman meant, the line filled with a low, distorted growl like someone else had picked up on the other end, someone who should not have been there. The woman gasped in terror, and the call cut off abruptly. After that, the calls grew more frantic. Sometimes the woman cried softly, whispering apologies as though she blamed herself for something that had happened long ago. Other times she spoke in clipped, panicked bursts, urging her to uncover the truth before it was too late. The one constant was the fear threading every word. It was the kind of fear that came from experience, not imagination, the voice of someone who had lived through the nightmare now reaching for her. Each call made her dread morning, because daylight brought the realization that the warnings weren't delusions, they were confirmations. Someone knew the Harrow family's secret. Someone had suffered because of it. And someone was risking everything to make sure she didn't become the next daughter claimed by the curse. The forbidden room in the Harrow house had been a shadow in her childhood, a place she was taught never to approach, let alone enter. Her father always said it was unsafe, that the old floorboards were weak, that the room held antiques too delicate to be touched. Yet there was something about his tone that made her uneasy, as if the warning wasn't about safety at all, but about secrecy. As she grew older, she noticed that the door was always locked, no matter the hour, and the key was never left lying around. The hallway leading to the room felt colder than the rest of the house, as though the air there belonged to a different time entirely. She had brushed against the doorknob once as a child and recoiled at how icy it felt, even on a hot afternoon. Her grandmother had caught her wandering too close and reacted with uncharacteristic anger, grabbing her wrist and pulling her away with a fearful intensity that stayed with her long after the old woman died. It wasn't until the house began behaving strangely that she finally discovered the door slightly ajar, as if the house itself had grown careless or impatient. Dust lay untouched across the floorboards, but the thin line of disturbed powder leading to the door suggested someone, or something, had recently passed through. Driven by a mixture of dread and curiosity, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of dried roses mixed with something metallic that made her stomach twist. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, revealing a room that seemed preserved in time, untouched yet deeply violated. Portraits covered the walls, dozens of them, arranged in precise rows like a disturbing family museum. Each painting showed a Harrow daughter dressed in a wedding gown, standing beside her father. Their poses were formal, almost regal, but something about them felt profoundly wrong. As she stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. Every single portrait had been deliberately defaced, the daughter's face scratched out with deep, angry strokes that cut through canvas and paint alike. Not a single daughter's face remained intact, as if someone had tried to erase their identities entirely. But what unsettled her even more was that every father's face was untouched, preserved perfectly, painted with a pride that now looked sickening. A thick silence filled the room, broken only by the faint creaking of the old house settling. She felt watched, not by the fathers in the portraits but by the absence of the daughters, the hollow spaces where their faces once were. It was as if the room held their trapped stories, their warnings, their suffering carved into the walls. Standing there, she realized the room was not forgotten. It was protected. It was a monument to a tradition too dark to hide and too deep-rooted to destroy, a silent reminder of what awaited her if she didn't break the cycle. She found the journals of the first Harrow bride by accident, though the discovery felt less like chance and more like something guiding her toward an awful truth that had been buried for generations. After the Forbidden Room incident, she couldn't stop thinking about the blank faces of the daughters, the hollowed-out spaces where their identities should have been. A restlessness grew in her, driving her to search deeper into the forgotten corners of the estate. One night, while a storm battered the windows and thunder rattled the spine of the house, she noticed a loose floorboard beneath her bed. The wood shifted under her weight, and with trembling fingers she pried it open to reveal a narrow compartment no bigger than a suitcase. Inside, wrapped in yellowed fabric, were several leather-bound journals so old they seemed ready to crumble at her touch. The journals belonged to the first Harrow bride, a woman named Lyra Harrow, whose portrait had been the largest and most violently defaced in the Forbidden Room. The entries began innocently enough, describing her life, her hopes, and her love for the open fields surrounding the estate. But as the pages turned, the tone darkened. Her writing shifted from elegant reflections to frantic scrawls, the ink blotched and smeared as though written in moments of terror. Lyra described a presence within the Harrow bloodline, something ancient and insidious that lived through the men and fed on the obedience of the women. It was not a curse in the traditional sense, nor a superstition, but a pact forged in desperation centuries ago, a pact that demanded a father bind himself to his daughter once she came of age, ensuring the entity within him remained anchored to the family. Lyra detailed her husband's transformation, how his eyes began to glow faintly in the dark, how his voice took on an echo not belonging to any human. She wrote of nights when she woke to find him standing at her bedside, unmoving, watching her with a hunger that went beyond the physical. She explained that the pact granted the Harrow men unnatural longevity, influence, wealth, and protection, but the cost was borne entirely by the daughters. Their lives became vessels to sustain the entity, ensuring it remained tethered to the mortal world. Those who resisted were punished, and those who submitted were eventually consumed. As she continued reading, she felt her pulse quicken with every revelation. Lyra had tried to break the pact, seeking help from priests, scholars, and travelers versed in the occult, but all attempts failed. Her final entry was a terrified confession that the entity had grown stronger through her suffering. The ink ended abruptly, a streak across the page as if the writing had been cut short by something violent. Holding the journal, she realized the tradition was not simply disturbing, it was predatory, systematic, and centuries old, and she was now its next chosen bride. Her father's announcement came without warning, woven into a dinner conversation so casually that for a moment she thought she had misheard him. They were seated across from each other at the long dining table, the flickering chandelier casting shadows that stretched and curled across the walls like watching silhouettes. She had been pushing her food around her plate, still shaken from the discoveries she had made in the journals, when her father cleared his throat, raised his glass, and smiled with a pride that made her skin crawl. He declared that the Harrow family would soon celebrate a new union, that his daughter, his only daughter, was to be wed when she turned 18 in just a few days. The room fell silent, as though the house itself was holding its breath, absorbing the weight of a tradition that had been repeated countless times before. She froze, unable to speak, her fork suspended in midair. He had spoken the words she had been dreading, the words she feared would strip away any illusion of normalcy left in her life. Her father didn't look at her the way a parent should when announcing something so life-altering. He looked at her the way a collector might admire a rare object finally ready to be displayed. His eyes shone with a strange mix of anticipation and triumph, as though he had been waiting her entire life for this moment. She felt every instinct in her body scream in protest, but her voice refused to surface. Instead, she sat there, numb, listening as he outlined details she had never agreed to: dates, rituals, preparations, all of it predetermined long before she was old enough to understand what was being done to her. What unsettled her most was the ease with which he spoke. There was no hesitation, no shame, not even the faintest hint that the world beyond their estate would find this abhorrent. To him, this was as natural as breathing, a duty carried out by every Harrow man without question. He spoke of it as though it were sacred, a blessing passed down through generations, completely blind to the horror twisting inside her. She realized then that he did not see her as a daughter with a future or choices, but as a vessel meant to fulfill an ancient pact. When she finally managed to whisper that she hadn't agreed to anything, he only smiled, a slow, heavy expression that didn't reach his eyes. He told her that no Harrow daughter ever agreed, because agreement was unnecessary. Destiny, he said, did not require permission. The way he spoke, with absolute certainty, made her chest tighten with dread. He believed she belonged to him, because every daughter before her had. The announcement was not merely a declaration, it was a claiming, a final step in a cycle designed to trap her just as it had trapped all the women whose faces had been scratched out of the portraits in the Forbidden Room. Her first attempt to escape began the moment her father's announcement settled in her bones like ice. She waited until the house went still, until the heavy footsteps of the Harrow staff faded into distant silence, until even the wind outside seemed to pause. She packed quickly, barely thinking, only acting, guided by a raw instinct that told her if she stayed until morning, the choice to leave would be stolen from her forever. She moved through the dark halls with a careful urgency, slipping past portraits whose scratched-out faces seemed to follow her with invisible eyes. The door leading out of the estate was just ahead, its brass handle glinting in the faint moonlight. For a moment, hope surged inside her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the metal, when the house shifted. It wasn't a creak or a settling groan. It was movement, deliberate and alive, like the house itself was stretching awake. The hallway behind her elongated impossibly, the distant candlelight narrowing into a flickering tunnel. The floorboards beneath her trembled, vibrating with a low hum that reminded her of a pulse. She tightened her grip on the doorknob and twisted, but it refused to turn, as if fused to the frame. Her heart pounded as she pulled harder, then shoved her shoulder against the door, but it held firm, unmoved by her desperation. The air grew thick and cold, pressing against her like an invisible barrier. She spun around, intending to sprint toward another exit, but the hallway she had just crossed was no longer the same. Doors that had been open were now closed. Walls had shifted, narrowing into a suffocating corridor. The familiar layout of the estate was gone, replaced by a maze that felt designed to confuse and trap her. Panic clawed up her throat. She tried another door, locked. Another, sealed tight. A soft whisper drifted from somewhere deep within the shifting house, indistinct but unmistakably aware of her. It sounded like the house was speaking, urging her back toward the center, toward the place where her fate was waiting. She ran anyway, following instinct rather than memory, but each turn only brought her deeper into the house's twisted geography. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each frantic step she took. She felt watched by something unseen, something that moved with her, guiding her away from escape and toward submission. Her breaths grew sharp and uneven. A cold draft curled around her ankles, pulling her like a ghostly hand. She stumbled, catching herself against a door that suddenly swung open on its own. Before she could react, darkness engulfed her, the door slamming shut behind her with a force that shook the room. She was trapped, not by locks or guards, but by the house itself, an entity bound to the curse, unwilling to let another Harrow daughter slip away before fulfilling the ritual. She had grown up believing her mother died peacefully, taken by an illness no one named, mourned quietly by a household that avoided discussing her with an almost reverent sadness. The story was simple, neat, and rehearsed, too rehearsed, she now realized. After the failed escape, after the house twisted against her like a living creature guarding its secret, she began questioning everything she had been told. Her mother's absence suddenly felt less like loss and more like a warning that no one had dared speak aloud. The first crack in the lie appeared when she discovered an old photograph hidden behind one of the scratched portraits in the forbidden room. In the picture, her mother was wearing the same wedding lace passed down through generations, standing beside her father with a forced, hollow smile. It wasn't a wedding photo anyone had displayed openly. It had been tucked away like an inconvenient truth. The discovery gnawed at her, pushing her to dig deeper. She searched the estate archives, the attic, even the locked cabinet in her father's study, her fingers trembling as she sifted through dusty documents and discarded relics. Eventually, she found a medical report buried beneath false invoices and donation receipts. It had her mother's name on it, but instead of describing illness, it detailed severe trauma, fractures, internal hemorrhaging, wounds consistent not with disease but with violence. The time of death aligned with the days following her mother's 18th birthday. Her breath caught as she read the final note, hastily scribbled by an unknown physician, cause of death inconsistent with natural decline. Someone had tried to expose the truth, but the note had never been meant for her eyes. The realization struck her like a blow. Her mother had not died from sickness. She had been killed or consumed by the very ritual her father now expected her to submit to. The idea that her mother had once stood where she now stood, terrified and trapped, filled her with a grief so sharp it felt physical. She remembered fragments of childhood memories, moments when her mother seemed distant, flinching at her father's touch, whispering words she could never fully recall. Perhaps those whispers had been warnings. Perhaps her mother had tried to shield her in subtle, desperate ways before meeting her own end. What haunted her most was the silence surrounding her mother's death. Every servant, every relative, every elder in the Harrow bloodline had adhered to the same scripted narrative, hiding the truth with the precision of people trained across generations to protect the curse. Their quiet compliance became monstrous in hindsight. They had watched a young woman perish under the weight of the pact and then helped hide the evidence as though it were the natural order of things. Standing alone in the dim corridor with the report clutched in her hand, she finally understood that her mother hadn't been taken by fate, she had been a sacrifice. And unless she acted quickly, she would become the next. The first time she truly saw her father transform, she thought she must be dreaming. It happened late at night, in the silence between one thunderclap and the next, when the house seemed to hold its breath. She had been hiding in the corner of the drawing room, clutching one of the journals, listening to the wind rattle the windows and hoping the shadows would conceal her. But then he appeared at the doorway, and the air changed. The warmth of his presence drained away, replaced by a chill that seemed to seep through the floorboards and climb her spine. His eyes, once familiar and human, glimmered with an unnatural luminescence, faintly amber and far too sharp for a man. His posture shifted subtly, a stiffness creeping into his frame, as if something foreign was testing the limits of the body he wore. He spoke, but the sound that came from him was layered, two tones at once, one calm and fatherly, the other guttural, almost feral. The voice echoed off the walls in a way that made it feel larger, inhuman, as though it belonged partly to the house itself. She stepped back instinctively, and he moved forward, slow, deliberate, a predator finally able to sense its prey. She could see the change in his face, his jawline seemed sharper, the skin stretched taut, the shadows beneath his eyes deepening unnaturally. His hands twitched as if controlled by an unseen force, fingers flexing with the precision of something trained to seize, to dominate. Every movement radiated power and intent, a physical manifestation of the curse she had been trying to escape. What terrified her most was not his form but what his presence revealed. The entity within him, the same one that had consumed all Harrow daughters before her, had taken partial control. She understood, in a gut-deep way, that if the ritual were completed, he would no longer be her father in any meaningful sense, he would be a vessel, a host for something ancient and remorseless. The transformation was a warning, a preview of the inevitability she faced if she failed to break the cycle. As she stumbled backward, he tilted his head slightly, a gesture that carried recognition and amusement, as if he knew she had seen the truth and yet it mattered not. The house seemed to pulse in rhythm with him, amplifying the unnatural aura that now defined his being. She realized that the Harrow men were never merely human, that the tradition she feared was supported by a force that made them something far more terrifying. The physicality, the presence, the power radiating from him in that moment confirmed every warning in the journals and every whispered message from the unknown caller. The men were conduits, the daughters vessels, and the entity thrived on both. The sight left her shaken to her core, but it also crystallized her resolve. She would not, allow herself to become part of what she had just witnessed. The transformation, horrifying as it was, became both her nightmare and her catalyst. The confrontation came at midnight, the hour when the house seemed to exhale the accumulated weight of centuries, when shadows pooled in the corners and stretched like living things. She had spent the day preparing, not with weapons or escape routes, those had already failed, but with knowledge, the words from the journals and the warnings from the mysterious caller etched into her mind. As the clock struck 12, she stepped into the forbidden room, the air thick with the scent of old roses and iron, the portraits of the defaced daughters staring down at her with accusing emptiness. Her father stood at the far end, his figure illuminated by the flickering candlelight, his transformed eyes glimmering faintly in the dark. He did not speak immediately, only watching her approach with a calm that belied the unnatural aura surrounding him. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. She demanded answers, the truth about the tradition, about the entity, about her mother. His response was not human but layered with that same guttural resonance she had witnessed during his transformation. He spoke of duty, of legacy, of the inevitability that bound every Harrow daughter, and with each word, the entity within him seemed to pulse, feeding on the tension, the fear radiating from her. She realized that this was more than a father-daughter confrontation, it was a battle of wills against something ancient and cunning, a force that had shaped generations through fear, obedience, and ritual. The room seemed to twist around her as she refused to yield, the candlelight elongating shadows into grotesque shapes. Her father moved closer, deliberate and unstoppable, and she felt the pull of the curse like a physical weight, a current dragging at her very being. But she refused to submit. Using the knowledge she had painstakingly gathered, she invoked the words and rituals described in Lyra's journals, speaking them aloud, each syllable a defiance against the centuries of darkness. The air thickened, pulsing with power, and the portraits of the daughters seemed to tremble on the walls as if watching and hoping for her to succeed. Her father lunged, not entirely himself, every movement unnatural, his form straining under the entity's influence. She dodged instinctively, continuing the ritual, her voice rising against the oppressive presence. The struggle was not just physical, it was spiritual, psychological, a test of courage against an almost immortal force. The house itself groaned, walls bending, floorboards trembling as the power that had controlled the Harrow family for generations resisted with all its might. The confrontation reached a fevered pitch, every second stretched by terror, by the knowledge that failure would mean becoming the next link in an endless, horrifying chain, while victory promised freedom at a cost she could scarcely imagine. The moment the curse finally broke was nothing like she had imagined. There was no triumphant fanfare, no dramatic release of light or sound. Instead, it began as a shiver that ran through the very walls of the Harrow estate, a subtle vibration that made the portraits of the daughters tremble as though breathing for the first time in centuries. She had completed the final incantation from the journals, her voice raw and unwavering despite the oppressive atmosphere pressing against her. The entity within her father recoiled, a low, guttural cry echoing through the corridors, but breaking the curse did not simply release her, it unleashed something far more unpredictable, something that had lain dormant beneath the weight of tradition for generations. The transformation of her father stopped mid-motion. The unnatural gleam in his eyes faded, the tension in his body slackened, and for the first time in years, he looked human again. Relief surged in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a chilling awareness that the rupture she had caused was not contained. The force that had maintained the curse, that had fed on obedience and fear, had been bound tightly for centuries. Now, with the anchor gone, it rippled outward, spreading through the walls, the air, and the shadows of the estate. The house groaned and shifted as if awakening from a long sleep, corridors stretching and twisting beyond comprehension. The very foundation seemed unstable, and she realized the curse had been a cage, and cages contain more than their prisoners, they contain consequences, and some consequences could not be contained. She stumbled through the hallways, trying to maintain her footing as the building responded violently to the release. Objects toppled, the chandeliers swayed, and the faint whispers of past daughters seemed to rise, a chorus of voices freed from centuries of silence. For a brief, terrifying instant, she felt as if every victim of the Harrow tradition was present with her, some relieved, some accusing, some warning. The entity, now untethered, clawed at the edges of the mortal world, a force of pure hunger and resentment no longer restrained by ritual or bloodline. She understood immediately that breaking the curse had not ended the danger, it had merely shifted it. The power that had bound her family was now free, unpredictable, and potentially more destructive than anything the Harrows had ever faced. Even as she escaped the immediate grasp of the house, she sensed that the price of freedom was yet to be revealed. Her own body trembled with exhaustion, her heart pounded, and a lingering dread settled over her. She had succeeded in stopping the ritual, in freeing future daughters from the inevitable fate, but in doing so, she had unbound a force that could not be controlled. The cost of breaking the curse was not just danger, but uncertainty, and the knowledge that freedom sometimes comes at the price of unleashing darkness into a world unprepared for it. The estate fell silent again, but the silence was heavy, pregnant with possibilities she could not yet fathom, and she knew that the consequences of her defiance were only beginning.